Now, the EU and the US have listened to people like you, and they've assessed what they see on the ground, both in terms of human rights, rule of law, and, you know, the issues we've talked about with the economy. They've had to weigh up the pros and cons of sending a signal to the international community by ending the targeted sanctions against ZANU-PF. They've chosen not to. Do you think they're right?
Well, they're very skeptical, and I understand why they're skeptical. They view Robert Mugabe as a wily politician.
Well, you're being a wily politician now because you're not giving me a straight answer.
I'm just asking you,
do you think the international community is right to say that they have not seen enough yet to end those sanctions?
I think that, to give you a straight answer, I think that they are wrong. I think that they are trying to be purist in their approach. They didn't apply that standard to the Good Friday Agreement. If you go back to the Second World War, if you adopted a purist approach, Churchill would never have spoken to Stalin. We had a much bigger danger facing our nation, namely its total collapse, its degeneration. And to that extent, I don't believe that the international community has given this arrangement a sufficient chance.
Okay, and what do you say to those Zimbabweans who say, listen to David Coltart, you know, for years he supported punitive measures against Mugabe, now he's sitting in his ministry, he happens to have lots of staff, and I'm not saying you have a cushy life, but you know, you enjoy the kudos of being a minister in the government, and suddenly you're saying to the international community, despite all the Amnesty reports and the Human Rights Watch reports, which still catalogue the human rights abuses that we see day on day inside your country, you're saying, you know what, lift all the sanctions. It does seem a little bit convenient given your new status.
Well, let's talk about sanctions. Sanctions were largely symbolic. There were never any economic sanctions against Zimbabwe. They were targeted against individual members. They were symbolic. They gave so much notice, for example, on the financial sanctions that most ZANU-PF hierarchy actually got their money out. So they never really had any impact in the first place. And ironically, my view now is that sanctions are being used most effectively by ZANU-PF. They use sanctions as a reason why they should not implement other clauses in the agreement. And so, to that extent, I believe that sanctions are past their sell-by date.
What about sport? You're a minister for sport as well. On the cricket pitch, there are still restrictions on Zimbabwe and playing in the international arena. Are you going to tell me they're out of date too?
Well, I think that they are, and I think that you've got to view Zimbabwe much in the same way South Africa was viewed in the early 1990s. There was no guarantee in South Africa that this process of transition would culminate in a democratic South Africa, but in 1991, the all-white South African test team was invited to the West Indies. And I think that the same policy should be applied to Zimbabwe. Sport can bond a nation, can give people encouragement to follow the process.
But we come back to where we started. The fundamental problem here is not just that Mugabe is still in power, but Mugabe wants to run again, as we understand it, in 2011. And you're suggesting that the international community should send this signal saying, you know what, we embrace Zimbabwe back into the international fold, the arena.
I'm not naive. I don't expect the West to embrace Robert Mugabe, to give its unequivocal support.
Well, what do you think he'll say? The day after the ICC, the International Cricket Authorities, announced that Zimbabwe can go back to playing tests with all other test-playing nations, how do you think Mugabe will present that to the Zimbabwean people?
Oh, I have no doubt that he'll celebrate and be very pleased.
And he'll call it a
himself.
Victory. And
of course he'll call it a victory, but ultimately that's not the point. The point is what is in the best interests of the Zimbabwean people. And yes, there are going to be small victories along the way for Robert Mugabe, but ultimately, so long as the people benefit, so long as it gets us through this terrible period and results in a democratic transition, then I think it will be worth it.
But how long are you prepared to ride this particular tiger? Because you agreed with me that you weren't entirely sure it would work, getting a new constitution, getting free and fair elections. How long are you prepared to let it try to work before you draw a halt and say, we've been used, we've been manipulated, and it hasn't worked?
Well, let me reiterate that I think it's too early to judge now. I think that we've got to get through the constitutional reform process. We've got to settle the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. We've got to get new electoral laws. But the ultimate test of this will be in the next election. That may be in a year's time, maybe in 2 years' time. At the outside, it'll be in 3 years' time. And that is when we will be able to decide whether this has been the right move or a wrong move.
But to be clear about this, you're saying if you don't like the new rules as they are established, you will walk away rather than play by them.
No, I don't think that any of us will walk away. I think that there is a determination in all three parties to make this work. We have no viable alternative. If we walk away from this, what are we left with? We will no doubt revert to the horror days of 2008. And so at this juncture, we simply have to make it work. If the constitutional process is totally subverted, if we have elections that mirror the June 2008 election, then of course we will have no choice but to walk away. But it's far too early to talk about walking away now.
David Coltart, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.